Welcome to the podcast of All Means All. In this episode, Claire O'Neill, Deirdre Forde, Ulla Sivunen, Carstens, and Cynthy Haihambo will talk about inclusive learning environments.
Why are there perceived barriers for inclusive learning environments?
Well, whilst education is envisaged for all, in examining schools from a cultural perspective and through the lens of ableism, it is evident that social inequalities exist, and schools are really not neutral environments. They really have evolved unconsciously almost and privilege the majority of students. And as a result, many students experience barriers and they remain on the outside of a normative group within schools. Therefore, it is important to cultivate inclusive learning environments in terms of environments that acknowledge difference and diversity. This chapter is quite a broad chapter in the sense that it develops an inclusive environmental framework, and it really to address the 13 dimensions within this book. Nonetheless, rather than address 13 dimensions, this chapter has decided to focus on 2, and they are neurodiversity and linguistic minorities. And these can be adapted by student teachers so they can address all areas of difference within the classroom. So on that note, I will invite Claire to talk about her lived experience of barriers that she has experienced within the school environment.
Thanks, Deirdre, for that. This is a topic that I don't speak about often from a personal perspective. It's more typically from a professional perspective. So I'm a professional working in the field of neurodivergence and autism for about 25 years. However, for much longer, I've also been a multiply neurodivergent individual. And my experiences of school have been more exclusionary than inclusionary, particularly as a learner. I'm not here to garner sympathy or to tell a sad story, but I think my lived experience does kind of highlight some of the issues that we will be talking about in the chapter. So in primary school, I would have experienced a very exclusionary learning environment. So I would have arrived at primary school, academically bright, very eager to learn. But because of my neurodivergence, the learning environment wasn't quite set up in a way to help me thrive. So, for example, before I ever entered the school environment, the school rules required me to wear a really scratchy, itchy uniform that I couldn't habituate to. So I arrived in uncomfortable from day one. And I had a really lovely teacher. However, areas that I would perceive as barriers to my education being inclusive would include, the curriculum. As I said, I went into school really, really eager to learn, and I quickly learnt how I looked like a learner wasn't what my teachers expected. So, and I think this still happens in schools today. Good learning typically looks like somebody sitting quiet, looking at the direction of the teacher. That's not how I attend, that's not how I concentrate, that's not how I learn. So I learn by moving, doodling, looking out the window, which of course was interpreted as lazy, fidgety, giddy, and so that was difficult because quite a punitive approach would have been taken to that. I never got the sense in school that teachers got me, so that led to a lack of sense of belonging in a school, which is really, really important for learners to feel included. I can remember sarcasm at the hands of teachers if I was too enthusiastic about a particular interest, and also the hidden curriculum was quite difficult. So the playground was quite a hostile and harsh environment, and with very little options for for learners who didn't want to spend their leisure time in a group playing organised games. Thankfully, all of these experiences have shaped my approach to inclusive education, and it means that I now realise from a very personal perspective the importance of making learners feel like they belong, using the curriculum as an inclusive tool rather than a tool of exclusion, and also being very conscious of the sensory and physical environment when it comes to learners who may learn and who may experience the environment in a different way to other learners.
Thank you, Claire, for sharing your lived experience. I think there's a lot of learning in there for future teachers in schools, and indeed teachers who are based in classrooms who watch this clip. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Ulla so that she can share her lived experience with us also.
Yes, thank you. I have similar experiences as Claire just told earlier. And this, for that reason, this is also personally interesting area for me. I'm a researcher on educational settings and also applied linguistics, and for years this has been also personally interesting for me, since my experiences in the school world and also in the work life has not always been inclusive. I've not always experienced I'm equal participant in communication. I feel that I'm sometimes in different positions than other people because I am a deaf person. Very often I also feel that I don't get all the information that is available for other people. And earlier in the school times and also in the work life, it's been very important to me to have the interpreting services and also services with my own language to feel equal with other people. So in the situations where I can handle my things and manage with Finnish Sign Language, which is my native tongue, it's very important for me. And interpreter services is of course one way of managing participation, to group participation, and also in the school years to manage to get without obstacles what teacher is saying. So for me, interpreting services are very vital in this sense.
Thanks also to Ulla for sharing her experience and for highlighting the importance of access to resources as well, especially interpreting services. Thanks, Ulla.
So, Deirdre, thanks for giving us an opportunity to share our lived experiences and for introducing two significant barriers, which are ableism and racism. And we have a number of other barriers. Certainly they're not the only barriers. In schools, sometimes lack of clarity around values and vision can lead to barriers. So for example, in my own school, we have 3 core values of kindness, care and inclusion, and all our decision making evolves and goes back to those values, and it helps keep inclusion at the corner of what we do with our learning environment. Now I know we have inclusion mentioned as a core value. It doesn't have to be, and you can still be really, really inclusive. Values lead into school culture and climate, and school culture and climate is hugely influential in my experience in how inclusive school environments can be. So for example, schools that have cultures and climates that support relationships, belonging, celebrate difference, are school culture and climates that are likely to be more inclusive in my experience. Then I suppose resourcing and support structures at a wider level will of course influence barriers. So if a school isn't well resourced, if teachers aren't very well resourced, this can be quite a significant barrier. And also the knowledge, skills and attitudes of all the stakeholders that act in an inclusive environment are so vital to really cultivating an environment that's inclusive for all learners. And this is something we'll discuss more in the chapter and in follow-on questions.
What needs to be addressed in order to make learning environments more inclusive?
There are many factors that need to be addressed in order to make environments more inclusive, and this was one of the reasons why we deliberated over a framework. So we came up with an inclusive learning environment framework with 6 components that may help teachers to cultivate more inclusive learning environments. And these 6 components are the physical environment, the cultural environment, the linguistic environment, the curricular environment, the relational environment, and the sensory environment. So firstly, I'm going to talk about the importance of creating an inclusive physical environment. So the physical environment is conceptualized as a space that is socially constructed through an interplay of objects, structures, and actions. How a physical space is designed and created can determine, the extent to the levels of participation, as well as how much children interact with each other. So successful interaction between children and other peers, for example, is often dependent on the way in which teachers set up a classroom and set up spaces within a classroom. So spaces can exude a sense of warmth and welcome, and these foster a sense of belonging and a sense of inclusion. And alternatively, the opposite as well, we often see spaces in schools that might be cold and a little bit detached. So teachers really need to be cognizant of, the spaces that they create, ensuring that they are welcoming, that they reflect different identities, that the visual displays are reflective of children's identities within the classroom. A carefully planned classroom can enhance the psychological comfort of students. So considerations around flexible and effective seating arrangements, lighting, acoustics, visual displays, temperature, ventilation, sensory spaces, all of these considerations are important in terms of influencing access to learning and achievement, student attitudes, and a sense of belonging in schools. So, for example, if we think of inclusive classrooms, or classrooms that are supposed to be inclusive, I know from visiting many classrooms as a supervisor or as a tutor in my own country, we often see, a child with special educational needs, for example, positioned at the edge of the classroom, and they may be there for long periods of the day. So again, that's an example of the use of space where it can actually function to segregate a student within a classroom. So teachers really need to be cognizant of the use of space to foster a sense of belonging and to foster social interactions that are meaningful within their classrooms. So in terms of the cultural environment, I very much see an interconnectedness between the physical and the cultural environment. And if we take the example that I just gave there of a child with a disability maybe positioned at the margins of a classroom, it very much exudes a sense of a difference in power relations, and that we're really maintaining the position of a child with special educational needs as other in spaces that I suppose are set up to exclude. And teachers really need to be conscious of the way in which physical spaces and social spaces interact to cultivate a sense of culture in the school. Because I suppose when you think about it, if this is in terms of the physical and the social space, it also impacts on other students' attitudes towards that child. And as I said, if we think of the other children in the classroom as occupying a position or a normative position, a homogenous group maybe within the classroom, they will very much view that child as other or outside the normative group. So culture and physical, the use of physical environment is very much interconnected. And I spoke about that already in the introduction to this video in terms of the way in which schools have evolved unconsciously almost for the majority as opposed to the minority. So we need to be careful not only in terms of the child with disability, but also in terms of children of all difference. So be it linguistic minorities, ethnic minorities, children with different religion, and so on. So on that note, I'm actually going to hand you over to Ulla, who's going to talk about the importance of culture in terms of linguistic minorities. Thank you, Ulla.
So regarding to cultural environment, I want to refer to UNESCO's Declaration on Cultural Diversity from 2001. It states that we need cultural diversity because it is a source of innovation, creativity, and exchange. Cultural diversity is part of common heritage of humanity. So we as educators should recognize and affirm it for the benefit of present and future generations. So different researchers say that school culture that respects every learner is the base for inclusion and development and change. According to Hargreaves' framework, operational school culture consists of different subcultures and relationships between them. This means attitudes, beliefs, valuations, modes of action, and interaction and social networks. So organizational atmosphere also forms a culture. And all these different factors build and support inclusive school culture. And then we have also the linguistic and communicative environment in the school. In societies, we have diverse people with diverse communicative needs. So we should manage learning environments that the way that it supports learners' language acquisition. Also, if they are users of minority languages. And we should support their language learning and language use, and this way their linguistic cultural identity. It can mean, for example, team teaching or peers and adults using the same language as the child, using multilingual media materials, teaching each other, and also linguistically sensitive curriculum planning. As we've been discussing cultural and linguistic environments, we have to keep in mind that also the diversity among the teachers is important, and them being as representations of diversity. But in relation to linguistic and communication environment, I still want to point out the deaf and hard of hearing people to whom visual and multimodal communication, language concordant communication, sign language or text-based interpreter and translation services are something that remove communication barriers and give pupils chance for independent agency in different situations. There are a wide array of different interpreting, technical and other applied solutions for every learner with diverse communicative needs. For example, simplified language, which makes language more readable, is useful for many people, and also for immigrants, for example. Using text, pictures, photos, sounds, gestures, spaces, and other resources simultaneously with spoken language or signed language create synergy in learning and communicative environments. These multimodal ways of communicating and learning support every learner.
So Ulla and Deirdre, thanks a million for going through the first three parts of the framework, and I'll bring in another two components of our framework, and they are curricular and sensory. And I think a theme running through our discussion here is very much the interconnectedness and the overlap between a lot of these components. So when we're looking at curricular, the curricular component of an inclusive learning environment, it is an area of particular interest to me. It's an area that I researched at the early phases of my career, and curriculum can mean very different things in different countries, and you know, the amount of autonomy a teacher will have over how they can adapt a curriculum. However, there are a few areas that we can look at to really enhance the inclusiveness of our curriculum. And I think when we're looking at curriculum, I think we're also looking at policy as well, and policies that inform and support our curriculum in schools. So I think it is really important to look at the curriculum through the lens of the learners that you have at present. I think that is really, really helpful. It would be an approach I would take when I'm adapting curricula to be inclusive. I am aware that other professionals may take a different lens, and that's also a really good way to look at curriculum as a component in creating inclusive learning environments. An example of that would be universal design for learning, where often the curriculum is the starting point for creating the inclusive learning environment. However, in my career, I've always used the person at the centre of my curricular planning. So some things that I would try and be aware of would be bias, ableism, as Deirdre has introduced at the start of our video, representation in the curriculum. Representation really, really matters. So are different groups being represented accurately and free of bias? For example, I taught in a school that had a lot of children from a Roma background, and when I was reading them picture books, all the characters were blonde and blue-eyed, and they looked very different to the children I was teaching. And I remember finding picture books that had characters that were more representative of the children I was teaching, and it made a really big difference to the children and their sense of belonging in the school. So I think that brings us to kind of role models and the importance of role models in curriculum, that we're not just looking at a certain type of role model. So for example, if we're looking at politicians, that we're looking at a wide spectrum of politicians from different cultures. And very related to that are skills like critical thinking. So I think critical thinking on the part of the teacher, but also developing critical thinking skills and critical literacy skills in the learners is so important. That will give the learners the skills to challenge bias, to challenge stigma, and and it will break down ableism. Our job as teachers is to give children and learners these skills. Curriculum can cause a lot of minority stress for minority groups, including neurominorities. And for example, a textbook that we had in our school had a character whose brother was autistic, and quite a bit of the story was how difficult that person's life was because her brother was autistic, which was obviously going to be very distressing for our autistic learners in the room. So, we chose a different text, and I think it's to be kind of situationally aware and to be aware of your learners. I can't emphasize that enough. And then looking at curriculum, I think the area of social skills for certain learners, social skills curricula are often recommended for neurodivergent learners, but that's an area where us as teachers have to be so critically aware and reflective of what skills we're teaching, and are these skills respectful and inclusive of the particular culture that the learner is coming from. And I think in that I've kind of shown a few ways that the components are quite interconnected. And of course, moving on to another component, which is the sensory environment, learners will find it very difficult to attend to the curriculum if their sensory environment is hostile. Research and accounts from lived experiences and my own lived experience, really tell me and inform me that a lot of neurodivergent learners in particular can find a school environment a particularly harsh and hostile environment from a sensory perspective. In in research and lived experience accounts time and time again, the everyday noise of school life is very, very challenging for neurodivergent learners, and a lot of these hostile noises in the soundscape can be changed and can make a big difference to the acoustic environment of neurodivergent learners. So, for example, adding more soft furnishing, reducing the volume of the bell or dispensing with the bell if possible altogether. School bells are quite distressing to neurodivergent sensory systems. School uniforms, if there isn't a lot of flexibility in what children are wearing, that can be very exclusionary for neurodivergent students who tend not to habituate to different textures as easily as other students. There's so many other examples, like lighting would be another aspect of the sensory environment that would come to mind. So harsh fluorescent lighting and the buzz that comes from, or hum that comes from fluorescent lighting is frequently cited as a huge stressor in the sensory environment.
And maybe not just even for neurodivergent
Absolutely.
learners, but sometimes for children with visual impairments, the glare
Absolutely.
from lights, for example, and even the importance of cultivating sensory outdoor environments.
Absolutely,
so,
Deirdre,
for example, having worked in the School for the Blind in Ireland, we had sensory plants where the children with visual impairments could feel, could smell them. So I think there's, so whilst sensory spaces are so important for children with autism and neurodivergent learners, I think all children benefit from them.
Absolutely, and I think what could be essential as an adaptation to a sensory environment, what could be essential to some learners is likely to be helpful for most learners. And that really brings us back to the concepts and kind of the principles of universal design for learning. And sensory environments can be sources of great joy for learners as well, and can really promote inclusion. So sensory environments that take a low arousal approach are often again cited as really supportive sensory environments. And I think as teachers, just because we're not experiencing an environment as difficult or distressing, I think it's on us to really believe our pupils, our learners, our students, if they're telling us that they're finding it distressing. And also students that may have sensory differences in how they experience the world and the environment, that can really change and vary over time. So a child that is finding a particular environment fine from a sensory point of view one day and is not the next, it's not that they're maybe not being truthful, it's just that sensitivities to the sensory environment can and do really change. They can change from day to day and over time.
With globalisation, education is almost evolving into a marketplace. And within this realm, it can be, I suppose, a challenge to cultivate inclusive learning environments. Neoliberal policy discourses are dominated by the values of self-interest, individualism, competition and comparisons. And with education coming to be more closely linked to economic growth and globalisation and global competitiveness, there is an increasing emphasis on standardisation and outcomes-based assessments for children. Thus, the tensions produced by the clash of conflicting philosophies that underpin inclusive learning environments and competitive market reform in some countries means that whilst education is meant to be for all, education is becoming commonly a private good in a competitive marketplace. Neoliberal discourses really shift the care away from education, in the sense that teachers are in pressurised systems trying to teach curriculum to large classes, and many research have shown that it can often strip the care away from the teacher and the attention that they give to students who need more support in the classroom. Performative pressures of teachers and students, therefore, are contributing to, rather than ameliorating, the marginalisation of students within the education system. And again, this goes back to the curriculum that Claire spoke about. There seems to be an over-concentration on academic performance, and therefore often maths and literacy are underlined as the important subjects. As I said, and the end goal is to try and get students to reach high academic achievement. And that is often at the expense of looking at the holistic child and also supporting all of those children in the classroom that need more support. Therefore, teachers have a huge responsibility to ensure that they cultivate meaningful relationships with students in the classroom, particularly students who are vulnerable and who may be marginalised within their classes. And if we go back to the examples of the lived experiences provided by Claire and Ulla, and I suppose both Ulla and Claire would have experienced good relationships with teachers, but in other scenarios, I suppose in your terms, Claire, they just didn't get you. Mm-hmm. And I suppose teachers really need to make an effort to get to know every aspect of an individual child, get to know their abilities, their strengths, their likes. And I think once teachers make that effort to ensure that they cultivate meaningful relationships in the class, they will make the classroom a better place to be psychologically for children. And in a sense, not always focusing on the child who needs support or the child who is of linguistic minority or ethnic minority, but in a sense it's really good for the classroom climate for all children. So that sense of care, and as we know, the ethics of care that Nell Noddings would have written in her research articles is of huge significance for teachers and students. At the end of the day, teachers are there every day with their students. It's really important that there is that sense of a relationship between teachers and students, and that the teacher is not there just to teach a subject, that the teacher is present, available to the children, that they cultivate a sense of agency amongst the children, and they listen to student voice as well. So often if they take the time to get to know children, they'll often know maybe or come to learn some of the barriers for children. They'll be able to actually communicate some of the barriers to a teacher, and then the teacher can actually enact upon their knowledge of these barriers and make the environment more inclusive for the child.
From all the information that we had today in this session, two things stood out for me. One is the importance of meaningful relationships and creating positive school climates. Now, what is the role and responsibility of the teacher in creating meaningful, inclusive learning environments? And is it really the teacher's responsibility alone?
I don't believe, and we as a group agreed, that it was not the teacher's responsibility alone, but that there are many stakeholders involved in this process, which we mentioned before in the chapter already. Unfortunately, schools around the world tend to be very traditional and very hierarchical work environments still. So teachers often tend to hold on to these traditional belief systems, and that limits them in their ability to promote social change. So by doing this, we frequently make schools a very inflexible work environment, which is unable or unwilling to adjust to the individual's needs. We very often take responsibility for changing the learner by diagnosing children, by categorizing them. Maybe we won't focus on the content or on the curriculum, but we rarely focus on the learning environment itself. So metaphorically speaking, it's perhaps similar to changing a plant that is struggling to grow, and not so much looking at the environment that the plant needs to grow in. So you would hardly change the entire plant, but maybe you would buy a new pot, you would get new soil, you would find somewhere else to put it. So we're treating humans in a completely different way. So one of the reasons that we hold on to these practices is that teachers often tend to have defensive routines, holding on to prevailing practices, which prevents them from entering into a critical discourse and finding constructive solutions for the problems. And while, of course, the open-mindedness of the teacher and a certain willingness and skill set is important, it's also really important that we get the learners to participate in the process as well. So they need to take responsibility for the creation and maintenance of their learning environment, and we need to take into account their individual needs and also the group dynamics and the dynamics of the school's environment in general. I personally think there's a certain condescension about the system's practice of categorizing and rationalizing human behavior, even though we might do it with the children's best interests at heart. So we often tend to exclude the children from these discussions that we have about the subject. And quite often they have a lot more rational and constructive approaches than we give them credit for. So sometimes they may struggle to express it verbally, but they certainly have something to say. And especially learners' behaviors that we may perceive as problematical, they're often sending a clear message. So it's very frequently a rational reaction to an inappropriate environment. So their voices often go unheard, even though they have valuable contributions to make to the whole discussion. By actively including the children and also their parents in the process of creating this learning environment, you can achieve a greater sense of belonging, and you have a potentially greater identification with the creative space. So you can work on your group dynamics, and also you get to have this shared space that you all can feel home in. And so in my own personal experience, taking this leap and handing over some of the decisions and responsibilities to the children can improve your relationship within the classroom greatly. And then again, you have to consider that the sense of home and the sense of belonging cannot solely stem from a space itself, but it's also made by the relationships, the rules, the boundaries of the people within it. So home is where the heart is, so to speak. So it's important to get to know each other, to respect each other's boundaries, to take the other person's perspective in order to understand them better. And that's an equally important factor to feeling at home and feeling welcomed and validated within a learning environment, which is a key aspect to be able to learn at all. In order to accommodate these needs, we try to devise certain strategies of what a space should be able to do. And we agreed that a space needs to be able to accommodate the needs of every individual. And it needs to be flexible and capable of adapting, like an organism, so to speak. So as the group evolves, for example, classes and children grow older, so they might want a different learning environment. They will want it to change along with them. Or specific situations might arise, and a room needs to be able to fit the requirements of the group at any given moment. So ideas that we had for that was creating spaces in which you can work alone, creating spaces in which you can work in a small group or in a larger group, creating spaces in which you can try out things like open laboratories, or, for example, creating spaces that students can use autonomously. And while the support of the school is very helpful and immensely important in this whole process, you can also, as a teacher, by yourself aspire to make a change. So even small interventions based on the organization of a classroom or an out-of-classroom experience can serve as a pilot project which can help to raise awareness throughout the school in future for these topics.
So from what you are saying, I'm gathering that this is the issue of school cultures and school structures. And I'm seeing the principal as an important person in this role, in the sense that you've mentioned other stakeholders, but it is still the principal that needs to draw in these other stakeholders in creating inclusive learning environments. If the principal buys into the idea of inclusivity and diversity, he or she will be able to get the rest of the partners on board and to also create a school climate that is geared towards diversity. And this means a climate in which all learners and all people that are working in this environment can thrive. If you look at the current schools, they have remained very traditional. We have changed the way in which we build houses, we have changed the ways in which we construct cars, but school environments have really remained the same for the past 4 decades or so. And you mentioned the fact that there should be spaces where children can play, there should be spaces where children can rest when they feel like resting, that are friendly towards all children. And for us, all means all. It doesn't have to be the focus only on children with complex special needs or the children from poor background. It should be everybody. Teachers should feel happy to come to school. Learners should feel happy to come to school. And the school should be that environment in which everybody feels at home, in which they experience that sense of belonging. So in conclusion, I think it is important that we start to shift our attention slightly away from examinations and academic performance to creating this open, loving, embracing spaces.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of All Means All. In the show notes, there is a link to the chapter in the open textbook. There you can find the transcript of the video and more information on the topic.